Miss Nobody from Nowhere by Elizabeth Ashton. Chapter 1. The girl opened her eyes and stared bewildered around the room in which she was lying, for it was unlike any place in which she had ever been before. It was a small room with wooden walls and a floor of beaten earth, and was warmed by a charcoal brazier. She found that she was lying on a narrow bed and covered by several quilts, for in spite of the heat from the stove, chilly draught circulated throughout the room. Her eyes sought the small square of window, which showed a blinding whiteness outside, which was reflected upon the ceiling. Snow, she registered vaguely. Wherever she was, it must be winter. She began to take in the details of the furniture, seeking a familiar object. It was crude: a table, some pottery utensils, a hand-woven rug by the bed, and a pile of cushions in one corner covered in leather. There was a single chair, and this surprisingly was ornately carved in an archaic design, being of the shape described as Hamlet. She knitted her brows in the effort to remember what had happened, and came up against a veil of darkness. Dimly she was aware that it concealed some tragedy, but what that was she could not recollect. She must have been ill, for she realized that she was very weak. The mere attempt to lift herself on the bed caused her head to swim, and she sank back defeated. She discovered one ankle was bandaged, and her shoulder ached. Curiously, she looked at her hands. They looked white and frail as she laid them on the quilt, and pitifully useless. She noticed that she wore no rings. Her long black hair was neatly braided in 2 long plaits, one over each shoulder. She was wearing a sort of chemise made of fine white wool, not, she was sure, her usual choice of a nightgown. She must have met with an accident, and this was a hospital, but it appeared to be a very primitive one. Again she tried to remember, but the veil would not lift, and her memory remained a complete blank. All she knew was that she was alive and in an unknown place. The crude wooden door opened, and a man and a woman came in. The woman wore a long full skirt and a shawl with a scarf over her head. She was old and wrinkled with faded blue eyes. She stood deferentially to one side to allow the man to pass her on his way to the bed. She remained standing by the door. The girl was only aware of her as a hovering, bulky shadow. The man was different. He radiated virile strength, causing the girl to sink back on her pillows, overwhelmed by his magnetic presence. He was not very tall, but he seemed to fill the little room, and he loomed over her like a giant, his size being due in part to his clothes, which had been chosen to withstand bitter weather. They consisted of baggy trousers thrust into high-skin boots, some sort of wool tunic, and a cloak lined with fur. But it was his head which drew her attention, for it was arresting. Under a caracal cap, his golden hair reached to his shoulders to join whiskers and beard, also golden, which gave him the appearance of an old-time Viking. All she could discern of his features was a straight nose, the haughty curl of nostril, and penetrating grey eyes, set beneath a finely moulded brow and thick, fair eyebrows. The girl looked up at him in faint astonishment, sure now that she was in the throes of some fantastic dream, while he, seeing that she was awake, addressed her in an unknown tongue, while his fingers sought for her pulse. An electric current shot up her arm at his touch, which was both unnerving and invigorating. Weakly she tried to withdraw her wrist from those strong brown fingers, while she murmured faintly, "Where am I? What has happened?" "So you've recovered consciousness at last," he said, with satisfaction in her own tongue. He released her wrist and stepped back. "Are you English or American?" She regarded him with a faint frown. "I don't know." The grey eyes became more intent. "You don't know?" he asked gently. "You mean you can't tell us who you are and where you come from?" Again she knitted her fine black brows in the effort to remember, but the impenetrable veil refused to lift. With a feeling of horror, she realized that she had lost her identity together with all recollection of her past. Tears of desperation rose to her eyes and trickled down her wan cheeks as she murmured forlornly, "It's all gone. My mind is just a blank." He knelt beside the bed and, taking her hand, stroked it reassuringly. "Don't distress yourself," he bade her kindly. "It's only temporary amnesia, the result of shock. Everything will come back to you in time. Meanwhile, you must rest and nurse your strength." She continued to weep, for she was very weak, and pulling a handkerchief from her pocket, he wiped her eyes as tenderly as a mother wipes those of a sick child. "Don't cry. You're among friends. We will take good care of you." Gradually, her sobs subsided, and she asked anxiously, "Was I in an accident?" He hesitated, then told her, "Well, yes, you could call it that." So she was in some sort of hospital, but the rugged figure kneeling beside her did not look like that of a doctor. She inquired, "Haven't I got any friends or relations who are asking for me?" Again, he hesitated. "This is rather a remote spot," he informed her at length, "and since winter has set in, communications with the outside world are difficult." "Then where am I?" "Actually, the village hasn't got a name, but you don't worry your head about anything. Just sleep. You've talked enough for the first time." He patted her hand, and laid it back inside the quilt. "We will do all we can to trace your friends. Now, Aziza will bring you some warm milk, and when you wake up again, perhaps you will remember." "Tell me first who you are." "My name is Clive Stratton. I'm an anthropologist, and I'm spending the winter here to study the people and their way of life. Fortunately for you, since I also am British." He signed to the woman, who quietly withdrew. The girl closed her eyes and lay still, already exhausted by this brief encounter and thankful to let her problems rest. The man rose to his feet and stood looking down at her compassionately. Her face was very white between her plaits of inky hair, and long black lashes concealed the eyes which had looked at him so despairingly. Eventually, he would have to tell her that she was the only survivor of an air crash in the valley. The plane... "Oh, gosh! Oh, boy!" The plane in which she was travelling had wandered off course, and apparently had struck a rocky peak, concealed in the low clouds. It had fallen into a ravine from which it would be almost impossible to extricate its remains, if there were any, but from the cloud of smoke that had ascended from the aperture, it would seem to have caught fire. By some freakish chance, the girl had been thrown out when the plane had disintegrated onto a ledge of rock which overhung the ravine, but no other survivors had been found, and there could be none in that almost bottomless crevasse. The traumatic experience had robbed her of her memory, possibly aggravated by other stresses she had undergone before the accident. The mind can bear so much and no more. Then it builds up its own defenses. Amnesia was infinitely preferable to madness. She would retain the memory of normal actions, speech, and habits of everyday life, for this was ingrained knowledge that functioned automatically. A spoon in her hand would remind her how to use it. A printed page would mechanically be read. Only the effort of recollection was beyond her. But at any moment some association with her past might bring it back to her. Clive Stratton was not a qualified doctor, but he had studied medicine, knowing that such knowledge would be an asset to him during his travels through the inaccessible parts of the earth that he liked to explore. But he had never anticipated that he would number a British girl among his patients, and one who had lost her memory. For from her speech she was undoubtedly British, with no trace of accent or Americanisms. He smiled wryly as he studied the pale face below him. The white light from the snow outside illuminated it, the features looking like carved ivory. They were delicately formed and definitely Nordic. The beautiful mouth dropped at the corners. She was unhappy, and would be more so when she learned the fate of the plane. Who had she been travelling with? Father, husband, or lover? Impulsively, he picked up her left hand and saw, as she had done, that it was ringless. Aziza returned with a bowl of warm goat's milk and made a slight obeisance. The big golden-haired man was to her a demigod. She was a sturdy mountain woman, but deference to the male had been taught by her people for generations, and in spite of modern teaching, which was spreading even into Asia, it would take many years for it to die out, and the villagers were Muslims. Clive dropped the girl's hand, aware that Aziza was regarding him slyly. Already her people had put their own interpretation upon the white girl's surprising advent. To their simple minds, the Doctor was a superman with his great powers of endurance and his medical skill. He had come to them out of the blue, and hospitality demanded he must be made welcome, and they had been rewarded, for he had effected many cures. But Allah knew men should not live alone, and since such a great personage naturally scorned the village girls, the Omnipotent One had in his own inscrutable wisdom sent a mate for him literally down from heaven. Only it was a pity he had not delivered her in better condition. Clive was well aware of their reasoning, and had made no demur when they had assigned a house to him and his patient after her timely rescue from the rocks. It was convenient to have her in the room next to his, for at first it had seemed she would die, and she needed all his skill by night and day, and accepting her as a challenge to it, he had only one aim, to endeavour to save her. Now that she was recovering, she might prove to be a complication. He did not want a wife. Aziza bent over the bed, raising the girl's head to take the milk, and with an impatient exclamation, Clive strode out of the room, as he opened her dark eyes and looked at him appealingly. The valley where the plane had met its doom was one of the many almost unknown settlements in the inaccessible regions of the Hindu Kush called Nuristan. Its people had intrigued Clive Stratton, for their origins were still mysterious, and they were unlike any of their neighbours, though officially a part of Afghanistan, for Abdur Rahman had subdued them in the 19th century and annexed their territory. But they continued to isolate themselves, and rarely was a Nuristani to be met with in other provinces. Already internationally celebrated for his research among obscure peoples, the Tuaregs of the Sahara, the Amazonian Indians, the Iranian nomads, Clive had come to Nuristan intending to spend the winter there studying the customs and origins of its inhabitants, and now found himself saddled with a girl who could not remember who she was. From the day upon which she regained consciousness, the girl's condition began to improve rapidly. She had no broken bones, though one ankle had been badly sprained, and her shoulder dislocated. She had suffered most from cold and exposure. It was a Nuristani shepherd who had found her and brought her in, but it was Clive who had ministered to her when she appeared nearly dead, spooning milk tinctured with spirits between her lips to revive the feeble spark of life that still flickered within her inert body. Beyond doubt she owed him her life, but whether she was to thank him for that or otherwise had yet to be revealed. He visited her every morning and evening, while in the interim Aziza attended to her wants. On the third day after her awakening, he considered that she was strong enough to be told about the air crash. She received the news without distress, for though it accounted for her presence, she had no recollection of any of the crew or passengers. "A dreadful thing to happen," she commented, but without feeling personally involved, adding meditatively, "I suppose I must have been with someone." "I hardly think you'd be roaming this wild land alone." "If only I could remember whom." But did she really want to remember? Inwardly she shrank from what she was certain would be painful knowledge. "You will in time." This was Clive's stock reassurance, but he looked puzzled. Amnesia of recent events was not uncommon after a shock, but not this total blackout. As for her, she found it hard to credit that she had ever known anything else except this primitive house and the wintry landscape around it. Of that she had had a restricted view from her small window, which showed little besides an expanse of glittering frosty whiteness, above a boundary wall also snow-covered. It was the mountainside that hemmed in the valley, and it reached far above her head. That was on fine days. On others the valley was filled with blankets of grey mist or whirling snowflakes. Time seemed to stand still during her recovery, marked only by Clive's visits. At first she had regarded him as simply a doctor, an impersonal being whose interest in her was merely that of a medical man in an unusual case, though his touch always thrilled her. But he did not often have occasion to touch her now. In his bulky clothes, with his beard and whiskers, he was rather like a youthful Father Christmas, especially as his attitude towards her was always kindly paternal. Since he was the only person with whom she could converse, for she could not understand anything Aziza said, His visits became the high spots of her day. She could not tell him anything about herself beyond what he already knew. It was supposed that she had been with some archaeological expedition, for when Clive showed her some shards of Grecian ware that had been discovered on the site of one of Alexandria's cities, they seemed to hold some significance for her. She surmised she must have been on her way to or from some dig, but Clive did not encourage her to think too hard. He feared recollection might inflict a further shock upon her already weakened constitution. Once her bodily health was re-established, her brain would resume its normal functions. So their conversation was perforce about impersonal matters. He was obsessed by Alexander the Great, who had once conquered a vast empire. He waxed enthusiastic about the Macedonians' campaigns, the army of disciplined Greeks who had routed the vastly superior force of the great Persian king Darius and chased him to the shores of the Oxus. He made the man come alive for her, although it was some 2,000 years since Alexander had been in Afghanistan. It was this great interest of his which had brought him to Nuristan, whose people, legend said, were descended from the Macedonian soldiers, for in the attempt to consolidate his new kingdom, Alexander had encouraged marriages between his men and the natives, setting the example by marrying Roxana, a Bactrian princess. Since the Nuristani had always been isolated in their almost inaccessible mountain fastness, the Greek characteristics might well linger, and they were a light-eyed, fair-haired race. Clive thought a stay among them without interference from the outside world might be revealing. "But you can't dig in the snow," the girl objected. "I don't dig. I study people, not ruins." "I study people, not ruins." "Then have you learned anything about the people here?" He shrugged his shoulders. "Not much that wasn't known before. They use chairs." He pointed to the one in her room. "Other Eastern people sit on cushions on the floor. Also spoons instead of their fingers. There were archaic Greek words in their language. Once they had a considerable culture, but Abdur Rahman destroyed most of it on the plea that they were idolaters. They declared they were Christians, and maybe their idols were statues of the Virgin and saints. Anyway, he imposed Islam upon them, and that was that. They still carve wood and live in wooden houses, as you can see." He took an object from his pocket and handed it to her. It was a silver disc stamped with a man's head. The girl looked at the straight nose and rounded chin, the sensual mouth and curly hair. It was vaguely familiar. "A coin from Alexander's day," Clive told her. "They're still to be found on the sites of his ruined cities." "After all this time?" "Yes. Afghanistan is a wonderful hunting ground for relics of the past." Some fugitive memory flashed through her brain and was gone, suggesting she had been connected with archaeology. "He's clean-shaven," she remarked, studying the coin. "Most of the younger Greeks were." He stroked his own impressive growth of beard. "So am I amidst civilized surroundings, but up here it's both convenient and warmer to let it grow." She tried to visualize him without his facial hair, and failed. "It makes you look venerable," she observed. He smiled wryly. "Exactly why I get rid of it from time to time. I'm not Methuselah." Occasionally, but rarely, he spoke of his personal life. He owned a house and farm in Dorsetshire. And had apparently sufficient means to be able to indulge his desire to roam. He never mentioned a wife or fiancée, but apparently he had a mother. Though the girl found his antecedents much more interesting than the history of Alexander, some instinct prevented her from asking questions. Dimly she sensed that some tragedy lay behind his self-imposed exile, and he was seeking solace in travel. He told her he wrote books and articles about the countries he visited. "Are you writing one now?" she inquired. "I'm making notes, but most of the day I spend with our hosts. As well as attending to their ills, I saw wood for fuel and helped tend the stock. That way I'm learning their language, which is different from the Pushtu and Persian dialects spoken in other parts of the country." "I'm afraid you must grudge the time you spent nursing me," she said. "Couldn't you have sent me to a hospital or something?" He laughed. "Through 20-foot snowdrifts, the valley is sealed off now until the spring, and it's not accessible to wheel traffic at any time. I'm glad to have some of my own race to talk to. For one thing, seems indisputable, you're British, and—" He hesitated. "You're an interesting case." I'm lucky that you've had some medical experience, she remarked with slight acidity. Okay. I'm lucky that you've had some medical experience, she remarked with slight acidity. She did not wholly relish being labelled as a specimen upon which he could exercise his amateur doctoring. Yet since she owed her life to him, she should be grateful. She was grateful, but she wished he would show a little more personal interest in her. He was her only companion, for Aziza hardly counted, but he always kept her at arm's length. A little reflection showed her she was being unreasonable. Once she was recovered, their ways would part. And though of necessity his ministrations were intimate, they would become hideously embarrassing if he permitted sex to intrude upon their relationship. For in spite of his venerable beard, he was not an old man, and she was aware of his magnetic personality. These conversations always took place in the evenings, for his morning calls were only a brief only a brief check-up, since he was in a hurry to be about his day's chores, and the girl looked forward to them all day. When evening came, Aziza would settle her in bed, light the inadequate oil lamp, make up the brazier, say something quite incomprehensible with a knowing smirk, and depart. She did sit up during the day now, in the one chair, but she had nothing to occupy her. All Clive could find for her entertainment was a battered encyclopedia which he carried with him, and although instructive, it was hardly amusing. She was thankful when bedtime came, and Clive came to her after his evening meal. He would sit on piled cushions on the floor, which he said he preferred to the hard chair, while she lay watching with shadowed eyes the flickering lamplight shine on his golden head and beard, so that he looked wholly composed of that metal, the frustrations and boredom of the day forgotten in the pleasure of having him there and listening to the tones of his deep, pleasant voice while he talked. Then it was she almost hoped she would never recover her memory, and this happy intercourse could go on forever. But that was impossible. Spring would eventually come to the valley, and she would have to leave it. And him. Clive taught her a few words of the native language so that she could at least say yes and no to Aziza, but he admitted he was not very proficient in it himself. Although he knew several Central Asian languages, Nuristani was unlike any of them. He called her Angela. You must have a name, little waif, he pointed out, and until you can remember your own, it'll serve. But why Angela? Seems appropriate. You drop from the sky like an angel. I hope it'll prove to be so, she smiled, but angels are not generally depicted with black hair, and I don't think my disposition is particularly angelic. That reminded her that she knew no more about him than she did about her past. The garments she had been wearing presented no clue. Trousers and shirt were torn and filthy and bore no recognizable tags. Her luggage and handbag had gone into the abyss with the wreckage of the plane. What sort of a girl was she wondered. Bad or good-tempered? Generous or mean? Friendly or unsociable? Our self-knowledge is built up through the years, but her slate was wiped entirely clean. She had a great longing to go outside, for her little room often seemed close and stuffy, and Clive forbade the window to be opened. In fact, it was doubtful if it would open. The outer air, he declared, was arctic. That would be preferable to the atmosphere of her room, which always seemed to smell of the mutton fat villagers used for cooking, and mutton and kid were her staple diet, served with rice or flat thin flaps of unleavened bread. Clive gave her vitamin tablets from his store of them to make up for the vegetable deficiency. One morning when Clive appeared, she greeted him with rebellion. I can't endure any more of this room. I'll go mad if I'm not mad already. I must get outside. I'm sick to death of this cell. Clive regarded her quizzically. You're for the West Country. You're certainly much better off if you feel like that. Though I warn you, I won't stand for mutiny. Instantly she changed her tone. Then please, Clive, mayn't I go outside? I am stronger, and I don't think it would hurt me. That's better, he said with approval. Meaning you'll do what I want if I grovel? She asked with a flash of mischief. In this part of the world, they consider that the right attitude. In this part of the world, they consider that the right attitude for women. And I confess I like to see my patients properly humble, he told her arrogantly. She was tempted to answer back, but decided that was not the way to get what she wanted, so held her tongue, and Clive went on. There's little sun today, so perhaps a turn in the open would do you good, if you wrap up. He said something to Aziza, who was present, and she slipped out of the room to return with felt-lined boots, a sheepskin coat, fur-lined fingerless gloves, and a heavy wooden shawl. This latter item, Clive insisted that Angela must wind round her head and face so that only her eyes were visible. "Aren't I supposed to show my face?" she asked, recalling that Clive had told her that this was a Moslem country. He grinned. "This isn't the veil, my girl. That's much more comprehensive. The Afghan chadri covers you from head to foot, with only a peephole to see where you're going. This is protection against the cold." She stumbled over the threshold, for the floor was uneven and her ankle still weak. With fatherly solicitude, he took her arm. "Lean on me." She was glad to do so, and some of his strength seemed to flow into her at the contact. They entered a second room, connected by a few feet of passage with hers. From the articles strewn about, this must be his. A bed similar to her own was along one wall, heaped with spare clothing, maps, and sheets of manuscript, suggesting he was not a tidy person. A typewriter stood upon a carved stool, which looked incongruous in that setting. A beaded curtain, drawn aside from a sort of alcove, revealed a stone slab upon which was an earthenware bowl and various bottles and packets of medications. "Your dispensary?" she asked curiously. "You could call it that. Lucky for you, I brought a stock of antibiotics. It was penicillin that saved your life. You had pneumonia, you know. But this was no doctor's clinic, only a sideline and his main objective, the study of the people among whom he was living. She had no claim upon him whatever beyond that of common humanity. Impulsively she exclaimed, "What a nuisance I must be to you!" "I wouldn't say that," he demurred. "I found you quite an interesting psychological study. Your reactions to your situation and environment are intriguing." Oh, she was piqued. In spite of their days of contact, all she was to him was a rare case. "So you've got me under the microscope as well as Nuristani?" she asked. The grey eyes glinted. "Of course." About to protest, Angela checked herself as the full impact of her predicament hit her. She was alone among a possibly hostile people, and only the fortuitous presence of the man beside her had given her any degree of security. Hitherto, she had taken his ministrations very much for granted. Now she began to realize how enormously indebted to him she was. She should be thankful he had found her an interesting case. The little house was completed by a third room, evidently used for eating, for it contained a table and chairs and another brazier with a grill for cooking. A Russian samovar stood in one corner with a row of teapots beside it on a shelf. Green tea was the usual beverage in that country. She took in its details in one quick glance. Then Clive opened the outer door and guided her outside, shutting it quickly behind them to preserve the precious warmth from escaping. Wrapped up though she was, Angela grasped as the keen wind cut through her thick clothing with the sharpness of a razor blade. They were standing in a village street, with wooden houses huddled all around them, and from a covered corral came the bleating of goats and sheep, but she hardly noticed her immediate surroundings for the awesome beauty of the scene beyond them. The village lay in a fold of the mountains above a valley floor, which in summer could be tilled, but in winter everything was buried in snow. On the horizon, distant peaks like carved white jade rose summit behind summit towards the eastern border. Over all lay a mantle of white glittering in the pale sunlight, except for the deep clefts running back into the mountains, which were shadowed with blue and purple, their inmost recesses almost black. The sun was too weak to have any warmth, and the cutting wind spun the surface snow on the valley floor into white froth. Frozen, shining, sun-struck to diamond splendor, it was the enchanted realm of the Snow Queen. "How beautiful!" she gasped through her muffling shawl. "But is there any way out? For the mountains seem to for the mountains seemed to hem the valley in from every side. Clive smiled at her naive question. Not in January, he told her. There is a negotiable pass at the end of the valley, but it won't be clear until March. Then I'll be stuck here for another 3 months? I'm afraid so. And there's no means of communication with anybody? None whatsoever. She was silent, digesting this information. She believed that a return to civilization would bring her memory back, or if not, she could make inquiries to establish her identity. But for many weeks to come, she must remain in this limbo with only Clive's company to sustain her. She glanced at him obliquely. His appearance fitted the savage landscape, with his golden beard, the round fur-edged cap on his head, and his sheepskin coat, which she noticed for the first time was embroidered with gold thread that gleamed in the light of the sun. His keen gaze was raking the valley with the glance of an eagle surveying its territory from its eyrie. E-Y-R-I? Eyrie? She felt small, defenseless, and unequal to facing the problems of her future, but so long as she was shut off here alone with him, there would be no problems. But he must resent the isolation that compelled him to continue to offer her refuge. You must grudge all the time you have to waste looking after me, she exclaimed impulsively. He turned his head to look at her. I don't grudge it at all. A gleam came into their grey eyes. There is a certain piquancy about our situation which I find diverting. The villagers believe you're my woman. Oh! She blushed fierily beneath her shawl, recalling all the intimate services he had performed for her, his room next to hers, with only a few feet of passage between them. Why do they think that? She asked defensively. In their world, a woman must have a protector. You were dropped by an obliging Allah on the doorstep, so to speak, for my benefit, he explained lightly. So they allocated us a house and provided Aziza to be your handmaiden. I'm glad you find the position amusing, she told him a little tartly. Some people might consider it ambiguous. Have you no, connections in England who would resent the situation if they got to know about it? She watched his face for his reaction eagerly, for this was something she discovered that she very much wanted to know. He turned away from her, but not before she had seen a shadow fall across his countenance, and again she sensed some hidden tragedy. My only female connection is my mother, he said harshly. She's very broad-minded. Still trying to probe, she persisted. Doesn't she miss you? Possibly. But she likes ruling the roost in my absence, he told her more gently. She's run the place ever since my father died, and doesn't like interference. Of course I go back from time to time to make sure all is well. After all, I'm responsible, and I suppose I'll settle there eventually. He turned his head to look at her directly. As for other ties, men like myself with wandering feet steer clear of matrimony. Was there a warning in his steely glance? Angela flushed again, this time with annoyance. Did he imagine she might use their situation to try to trap him? She did not even know if she were free. I'm sure you do, she said icily, but in spite of the providence of Allah, you're quite safe from me. I don't regard you as dangerous, he told her, laughing. Poor waif, you're a mere child, and I'm not a cradle-snatcher. He dropped a possessive hand on her shoulder. You've been out here long enough. You'll be getting frostbitten, and turned her back towards the house. Somewhat unwillingly, Angela re-entered their abode. She was not sure what, but she was beginning to find his paternal solicitude irritating.